Okay, see if I can make this. Ah, that's better. Okay, I'll just move my webcam. Okay, all right. I don't think I've ever seen a day this dark in my 5 years in Kuwait. So this is quite something. Some people were wondering if they should, in fact, cancel classes today, and I think that was a very wise decision. There are puddles everywhere outside in Salmiya, and I can only imagine that it's much worse elsewhere. Hmm, it's still here. Okay. Okay. Is there anybody out there? Doesn't look like there is anyone yet. Okay. Okay, that's fine. So if there's nobody right now, I will just begin the lesson, and you can watch this later whenever you want. Okay. So before I continue, just one last bit of housekeeping. It looks like tomorrow, so this is Wednesday at 3 p.m. local time. The rumor is that classes might be canceled tomorrow as well, just like today. If the weather continues like this, even until this evening, I can't see how we'll have class tomorrow. So the rumor right now is that classes will be canceled tomorrow, and Thursday's my long day, so I won't really complain that much. If that's the case, at some point, there will be makeup days at some point later in the semester, likely on a Saturday. That's what they've done in the past before I came here. So stay tuned for that. So that's all I know right now. At some point, though, I think, very likely that the administration will ask us to make up at least one of the classes we missed. Okay, so I'll just get started. Okay, so I asked you to look at two uh, poems for today, two sonnets, in fact. One of them is in our text, this one here, on page 745, at the top there, William Wordsworth, The World is Too Much With Us, page 745. The other one, it's not in our anthology. It was in the previous anthology I used. It's one of my favorite poems, and you can get it online for free. I've posted the link on Moodle. It is Hap by Thomas Hardy. Okay, not the actor Tom Hardy, although they might be related, but this is Thomas Hardy, the Victorian and even Edwardian writer, wrote famous novels, including Tess of the D'Urbervilles, Jude the Obscure, and so on. But I think he wrote some wonderful poetry as well. So I'll spend some time talking about both of these. So let's begin with Wordsworth. We're supposed to look at something else by Wordsworth early in the semester. I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, which is also an anthology. Wordsworth is probably the most famous, what we call romantic poet. I think the coffee hasn't kicked in yet. Um, Capital R romantic, sort of the from the romantic period, the early 19th century. You'll learn more about that in 221. But just know that when you're reading Wordsworth, you're reading a romantic poet, not like a smoochy romantic, but the literary movement known as Romanticism. Okay, so we'll talk a bit more about that after, but let's just focus on the poem itself. Okay, so again, we have a title in square brackets, which means it's a title the editors have given us because Wordsworth did not give this poem a title. and so it just follows the first line. All right. So what do we have here? First, we have a sonnet. Okay, it's 14 lines long. We have a rhyme scheme of A B B A B B A C D C D C D. Okay, so it's the rhyme scheme is it looks more Petrarchan or the more Italian style as opposed to the Shakespearean, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But this is very much a Petrarchan sonnet in one fundamental way, which we'll get to when we get there. All right, so the world is too much with us, late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. Okay, so first things first, the world is too much with us, late and soon getting and spending. So what is he talking about here? Okay, so getting and spending, he's talking about, acquiring stuff, getting stuff, and spending money. Okay, so so by getting and spending though, we lay waste our powers. Okay, so we know immediately that this is, whether you want to call it anti-consumerist or even anti-modern in some ways. So and typically, yes, I can't think of very many poets who think that acquiring stuff or having money even or spending it is a good thing. Now, this is one of the sort of the almost cliches in literature going back thousands of years. Even poets from ancient Greece and Rome complained about it. It would be curious to see a poet who actually talked about stuff like getting stuff and spending money as a good thing. Okay, so but it's not just a bad thing, but we lay waste our powers. Okay, so uh, by getting and spending, we're sort of wasting ourselves. Little we see in nature that is ours. Okay, so not just sort of anti-consumerist, but um, we have become separated from nature. Okay, capital N nature. Okay, so now this is important because I don't. People, you can spend a lot of time talking about nature because this is a word that pops up in the 18th century a lot, especially and in the 19th century. And for someone like Wordsworth, yes, nature did include the rocks and the trees and the sea, as we'll see soon. But capital N nature was something broader than that. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So little we see in nature that is ours. Okay, so we don't see that we belong to it or it belongs to us at this moment in time. This poem, by the way, was written, as it says at the bottom, in 1807. So a couple of hundred years ago. We'll talk a bit more about the context in a bit. We have given our hearts away a sordid boon. Okay, so we've given our hearts away to what it's not clear yet, but we've given them away a sordid boon. A boon is like a gift or a favor, and sordid, of course, is like dirty or spoiled. Okay, so this dirty gift. Okay, it's a very clever phrase there. Okay, so this we've given our hearts away. It's not a good thing. The sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours, and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. Okay, so he gives a couple of examples like the sea that does this, the winds that do this, the flowers that do this. And for these things, and for, in fact, for everything, we are out of tune. Okay, this is a curious metaphor. What does it mean when something is out of tune? It's a musical metaphor. Okay, so when your guitar is out of tune, you have to tune it up. Something is out of sync. Something needs to be adjusted. Okay, so we are out of tune. In other words, with this stuff that's all around us, with nature, perhaps with ourselves, we are out of tune. Okay, so finally, it moves us not. Okay, so this all this stuff he has talked about, it moves us not. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan. Okay, so remember we talked last class about sonnets and their structure. Yes, they have a rhyme scheme, which there can be variations in them, but they typically follow one sort of rhyme scheme. This is a Petrarchan rhyme scheme or Italian. Also, excuse me, the structure of this poem is Petrarchan. We looked at Shakespeare's My Mistress's Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun. Shakespeare wrote what we now call a Shakespearean sonnet. And we have there, as one student commented, it has a Shakespearean sonnet has a 4-4-4-2 structure, which means you have sort of four lines that are connected to each other somehow, and then you have that final couplet, two lines. Okay. In a Petrarchan sonnet, you have the first eight lines known as the octave, and the last six lines known as the sestet. But what separates them is, we talked about this last class, a volta, okay, the Italian word for a turn or a twist, some kind of shift. Okay, so in the Shakespearean sonnet, you have three groups of what we call quatrains, four lines each, and then you have the volta just before the couplet. Excuse me. In the Petrarchan sonnet, you have the octave, the first eight lines, and then you have the volta, and then you have the final six lines. Okay, so what the Petrarchan sonnets, what they do is typically the first eight lines, the octave, you have a situation or a question or even a problem, some kind of a setup in the first eight lines, and then you have the volta, and in the last six lines you have either the resolution, the solution, or some kind of a response to what went before. Okay, so maybe a proposition and a response. We'll see that when we get to Hardy's poem, but that's what's going on here as well. Okay, so in the first eight lines, Wordsworth tells us this situation right now, the world is too much with us. We waste our powers. Recently, we've been wasting our powers by getting and spending. We're out of sync. We're out of tune with nature, with all this other stuff. It moves us not. And then halfway through this ninth line, great God, okay, I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn. Okay. So in the sestet, we have a kind of response or a solution to what was going on. So great God. Okay. So God is capitalized. So it sounds like, remember, this was 1807. Like any good Englishman, Wordsworth would have been a Christian. So it sounds like he's referring to God. But then he says, I would rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn. A creed is what? A system of beliefs. Okay. So I would rather be, sort of this, someone living in this, this system of old, outdated beliefs. Okay, creed outworn. It's a very concise way of saying that these old-fashioned, very old stuff we don't believe in anymore. Um, I mean, Britons hadn't been pagans for thousands of years. Okay, so I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn. And suckled, by the way, is an interesting metaphor, right? We suckle, babies suckle on their mothers, right? So that's how they're nourished. That's how they grow up, right? So it's a curious metaphor there. So I'd rather be sort of raised, or nourished by, these outdated beliefs. So might I, so that I might. Okay, remember poetic syntax. Standing on this pleasant lea, in other words, this pleasant meadow, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn. So I could see some stuff that would make me less sad or less despondent. Have sight of Proteus, in other words, so that I might have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. And by the way, the little accent on the wreathed, a lot of older poetry does this, and sometimes the editors put it in for us to remind us that, at that time, in the 19th century, especially in Shakespeare's day, they often pronounced certain syllables we don't pronounce anymore. So now we would say wreathed horn, but back then they would say wreathed, right? So that adds a syllable there, and we talked about, meter. So oftentimes, we need to pay attention to the meter, and writers use certain words, sometimes with more syllables, just to fit the meter. And Shakespeare does this a lot as well, by the way. Okay, so I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn, so that I might, standing on this pleasantly, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, so that I might have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. Okay, so what's going on here? So this is the situation he describes in the first eight lines. He's describing what it's like to live in 19th century, Europe. Now, don't forget that in the early 19th century, this is after the Industrial Revolution, England, was the most, advanced, if you want to use that word, country on the planet. Like it was the most technologically advanced country on the planet, and the people were living in bigger cities than they were before, and the belief system was changing, and well, the lifestyle had changed quite a bit from what it had been even 2 centuries earlier. You can see, by the way, how I think this is a good question, is that would this poem still work today? And I think in some days it does. In some ways, not much has changed in 200 years since Wordsworth's day. So at the end there, so I would rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn, so I can see these things that would make me less forlorn, less despondent, less sad. Okay, what are these sights? Proteus rising from the sea, or Triton blowing his wreathed horn. Now, what he does here when he refers to Proteus or Triton, this is what we call allusion, Allusion. I will put the term in Moodle. Allusion is something you will come across again and again and again in this class and in other literature classes. Whenever a writer, a poet, a playwright, whoever makes a reference to either another work of art or another literary work, another fictional character, or even a real historical event or person. So something outside of the text. Okay, a lot of older writers, probably up until the 20th century, would often make what we call mythological allusions, right? So this is what Wordsworth is doing here. So now, even if you don't know who Proteus or Triton are, you don't even really need to know who they are. Just know that they're ancient classical pagan gods. They're actually not even major gods, interestingly enough. But the note at the bottom tells us that Triton was a sea deity. Actually, Proteus and Triton were both sea deities. And for those who are reading the Odyssey or have read the Odyssey for 220, you might be familiar with Proteus. We actually have a word in English, protean, which is an adjective to describe something that keeps changing its shape. And Proteus was this minor sea god, and people would, if you could catch him, if my memory serves, he would either tell you your future or just answer any question you had. But he would keep changing his shape to try to get out of your grasp, right? So that's who Proteus was. But in short, uh, he would rather be this person with these old beliefs so that he might have sight of Proteus rising from the sea or hear old Triton blowing his horn. In other words, these old mythological things, these old mythological beings and events that no longer exist. Okay. Now, here's the interesting thing. Now, Wordsworth doesn't say that I this is the solution that everyone should follow, or that I will become a pagan again, and so all these things will happen. Okay, but look at his language. I'd rather be okay a pagan in a creed outworn. So might I see have glimpses that would make me less forlorn. Okay, so in other words, he's not obviously if you become a pagan, Proteus and Triton would not come back from the underworld or whatever. They would no they never existed. They no longer exist and they never have existed. But he's talking more of a mental attitude, how we look at and interpret the world around us. Okay, so I'd rather be this pagan so that I can somehow be more in touch with what's around me. Okay. Now I don't think he's even saying that this is possible. So he's like, I'd rather be this so that I'd be less forlorn. But I think his language suggests that this isn't really possible anymore, and for good reason, right? We're not pagans. These beliefs were discarded a long, long time ago. But I think he's suggesting that there was at least something to that, that they were, at least with these, especially older pagan beliefs, you had a god of the sea, a god of this, a god of that, everything. Like your desk probably had a deity behind it. That was somehow made the world make sense more and made you more in tune with the world around you, to use his own metaphor. Okay, so that's Wordsworth's "The World Is Too Much With Us." It's one of his most famous poems. It is widely anthologized, and I think a good question to ask is, would this poem still work today? If so, would it stay the same? Would you modify anything about it? That's something to think about. Okay, so let us then move on to Hardy. Okay, and I have here Hap by Thomas Hardy. This was written sometime in the late 19th century. He had a long life. He actually lived in two centuries, the 19th and the 20th century. He actually started his career. This is just some trivia for you. He started his career writing novels. That's how he got famous. You can still go to a bookstore here probably and find at least a couple of his novels. The most famous are Tess of the D'Urbervilles and Jude the Obscure. He wrote many other ones as well. And then towards the end of his life, he started to write poetry again. And he wrote this phenomenal piece that I believe is in our anthology. I had put it on the syllabus, but we won't have time to read it. And it is called Convergence of the Twain, written in 1912, and it's about the sinking of the Titanic, right? And and that's a poem that I think still speaks to us in many ways. So if you're interested in that, it's not a long poem. It's again one of my favorites. If we had time to read it, we would. But that's in our anthology. I don't remember what page it's on, but just look for Hardy in the index or Convergence of the Twain. So when these two things come together, in other words. Okay, so this one we have is Hap. So the first thing, again, we should do is, especially if you're reading an older poem, is not just ask yourself what is the title, but what does this word, what does every word mean? Poetry is, as we've said before, and I will say again, very compressed, much more so than fiction is. And so every word, every line, every space is significant. And every word, even an adjective, is chosen deliberately. So we'll look at this. Hardy does this very well in this poem, especially. And sometimes adjectives can have two or three meanings. We saw this when we looked at what's his name? My Papa's Waltz. Boy, it's really misty outside. Something you don't see here very often. A great day to talk about poetry, by the way. So ask yourself, what does the title mean? Of course, titles are very important in poetry when we do have them. But also, if you don't know what a word means, you should look it up because there's a reason that word is there. Okay. So hap is a word we don't use much anymore, but it just means luck or fortune. Okay. And here's some interesting trivia for you. It is related to the word happy in English. Okay. If someone is happy or someone was happy, the way I mean, the word has been around for a very long time. But in the old days, by which I mean, I don't know, probably before the 19th or 20th century, if someone was happy, it literally meant they were lucky, right? They had hap, okay, or hap happened. Okay, hap is also related to this word to them. Okay, so and if you don't believe me, you can look this up. Look up in any half decent dictionary. Look up the root of the word, the etymology. Happy, it comes from hap, so which means luck or fortune. Okay. So immediately we know this poem is about luck or fortune or maybe the lack of hap or happiness or something like that. And again, we do have a sonnet here, 14 lines. We have the sections of the poem are separated. Okay, and sometimes some editions will do this, and you can see how in a sonnet that makes perfect sense. Um, so let's have a look at this one. Okay. If but some vengeful god would call to me from up the sky and laugh, thou suffering thing, know that thy sorrow's my ecstasy, that thy love's loss is my hate's profiting. Then would I bear it, clench myself and die, steeled by the sense of ire unmerited, half eased in that a powerfuler than I had willed and meted me the tears I shed. Okay, so before I continue, so let's look the first quatrain, the first four-line stanza. Okay, we have an AB rhyme scheme. Hardy doesn't follow meter as much as other poets like Wordsworth or John Donne or Shakespeare does, but this is still primarily written in iambic pentameter. Okay, so an iamb, remember, is an unstressed followed by a stressed syllable. And if you have those two syllables together, that's one foot, that's an iamb. Okay, so if but some vengeful god would call to me from up the sky and laugh, that's perfect iamb. Okay, Not every line does this. Sometimes, when poets want to really emphasize a word or a phrase, they would begin with a stressed syllable. But the general rhythm is iambic, as it is with most English poetry. Okay, and if you have five of these, what we call feet, so unstressed, stressed, or five iambs, it's iambic pentameter. Okay, so if this is how he begins, if some vengeful god would say to me, so he's imagining some situation that may or may not exist. So, if there was some vengeful God who would say to me from the sky and laugh at me and say, "Thou suffering thing, you know that thy sorrow is my ecstasy, your love's loss is my hate's profiting." So this is very personal. The poet is saying, if there was this vengeful God, sort of you imagine again, this is one connection to Wordsworth's poem, one of those classical, those petty classical gods, right? Who were not very well behaved. Says, let's imagine one of those who looked at me and laughs and says, "Oh, you little suffering, puny thing. Um, the more you suffer, the sort of happier I get, and the more love you lose, the more I win from that." Okay, so in that last line of the first stanza, thy love's loss is my hate's profiting. So one, there's a financial metaphor there. Okay, profiting. Okay, so the more love you lose, and I think he means love in the general sense, love of self, love for mankind, and so on. The more love this puny human loses, the more this vengeful God profits with hate. Okay, so in other words, let's imagine there saying that this vengeful God just made my life difficult. Okay, was deliberately making my life difficult. Next quatrain, line 5. Then would I bear it, clench myself and die. So it's curious. He begins the first quatrain, if blah, 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 then blah, blah, blah. So if this is the case, then would I bear it, clench myself and die, steeled by the sense of ire unmerited, half eased in that a powerfuler than I had willed and meted me the tears I shed. So if there was this vengeful deity who is deliberately making me suffer, making my life difficult, then would I bear it. Then I would just put up with it, deal with it, clench myself and die, steeled, like hardened by the sense of ire unmerited. It's a great line. It just means ire is anger, okay? Unmerited anger, okay? Half eased in that a powerfuler than I, in other words, a powerfuler being than I, had willed and meted me the tears that I shed. So, in other words, if there was this vengeful God who was powerfuler than me, of course, who was deliberately making my life difficult, then I would put up with it. I would clench myself and die. I would be sort of strengthened by the sense of this unmerited anger. Uh, and that this in other words, there's a meaning to this madness. Okay, so there's a reason why I'm suffering. There's a reason why my life is the way it is. But not so. This is line 9. Okay, so remember I said this is a Petrarchan sonnet. Okay, the rhyme scheme, by the way, is A B A B C D C D E F E F E F F E. So it actually has a Shakespearean rhyme scheme without the final couplet, but more importantly, the structure of it's actually Petrarchan. You have this sort of proposition in 8 lines, the octave, and then but not so. You have the sesta, the volta, excuse me, the volta, the turn or the twist, which begins the sestet. And the sestet, the final 6 lines, there we have the resolution or a response to the situation that was explained in the first 8 lines. So we have this proposition set up. It's very logical, in fact. It's set up in the first 8 lines, and then but not so. So if there was some vengeful God, then I would bear it, but not so. In other words, what I spent the last 8 lines very poetically elaborating on uh, does not exist. This is not the situation. So if there was some vengeful God who was making my life difficult, then I would actually feel better about it because I'd know that there was this powerful deity who was making my life difficult. There's some sort of reason for my suffering, but this is not the case. But not so. How arrives it joy lies slain? This is line 9. How arrives it joy lies slain, and why unblooms the best hope ever sown? This is a great line. So, and he asks a question. He asks us, either us or himself, a question. How is it that joy lies slain? That's a very curious metaphor. You literally kill joy. Okay, joy lies there dead. And why unblooms the best hope ever sown? Okay, there's a very curious metaphor in this line here, and I hope you caught it. And two words tell us what this metaphor is. So let's go backwards. Hope ever sown. Okay, what does it mean to sow something? There's a very famous expression in English which comes from the Bible, from the New Testament. You reap what you sow. Okay, sowing is when you're planting. Okay, it's an old word we use for planting, planting seeds. And when you sow, when you what you we reap what we sow, it actually means this is one of Jesus's famous sayings. You gather or you collect what you plant, right? In other words, okay, so you reap what you sow. So literally, farmers, and we wouldn't survive without food, but farmers, they collect what they plant. Okay, but metaphorically, we all collect or gather what we sow. So much more metaphorically, and you can see why this expression has stood the test of time, thousands of years. If you, for example, if you're lazy and you don't do your homework, uh, you reap what your teacher might say, you reap what you sow. You sort of have not you don't have any crops to gather because you didn't plant them properly, right? So we sow hope. That's a very interesting metaphor. We sow hope. We throw, and sowing, in my mind at least, is when you gather like a bunch of seeds and just kind of throwing them around, hoping something will grow. Okay, it's less methodical than, say, modern farming, right, with machines and stuff like that. So we sow hope, hoping that it will grow into something more tangible, right? So it's a curious metaphor right there. So something we sow, something that gets planted, something that grows, and something that we eventually can hold on to, right? So why unblooms the best hope ever sown? So all our best hopes that we sow, they unbloom, which is another part of this metaphor. It's a very curious word, very poetic word we would not use in everyday language. What does it mean? Well, what does it mean when something blooms? Okay, it's a flower or a plant blooms. Okay, when it grows and it's ready to, I guess, to be admired or to be eaten or whatever, it blooms. Okay, we can't enjoy it, even if it's a flower. We can't enjoy it before it has bloomed. Okay, you never go to the flower shop and see flowers that haven't bloomed yet. Okay, they have already bloomed. So the best hope ever sown, what causes that to be unbloomed? That's a very curious metaphor, because I kind of see it. It's like, imagine a flower going backwards like this. That's unblooming. Okay? What causes this? The poet asks us. And he tells us in the next line, crass casualty obstructs the sun and rain, and dicing time for gladness casts a moan. Okay. The third line there needs some explanation. And again, if you don't know what crass casualty means, you should look it up. It's a phrase unique to Hardy. No one else really uses it. But it is, casualty and time are capitalized, by the way. So this is important because they are personified. He's not talking about time, for instance, when the way we say, "Oh, what time is it?" Right? So time, capital T. This is personified. I'll get back to that one in a moment. Casualty, capital C. Okay. So casualty is when we talk about casualties now, but what the word actually means, it's related to the word casual, and casual means something that just happens by chance. When you have a casual encounter with someone, we mean it's informal, it's relaxed. We wear casual pants. But if you're walking the avenues, which some of you might be doing today on a very very wet day, and you bump into your friend, that's a casual encounter. It happens by chance. Okay, so capital C casualty. Okay, this is Hardy's way of saying the personification of chance. Okay, crass is a word we also still use. We use it to refer to people usually. Someone is crass. I've been referred to as crass occasionally. Crass just means sort of unrefined or maybe without much thought. Okay, so someone who's being crass is they're refined, they're not very sophisticated, they don't think before they speak. Um, some might even say low class, something like that, right? So crass casualty is personification of chance, but not just chance, sort of chance that doesn't even really think. Okay. Crass casualty obstructs the sun and rain. Okay. So obstructs everything. And going back to the metaphor in the previous line, casualty obstructs the sun and rain, which is what hopes need to flower, right? Okay. Without sun and without rain, stuff doesn't grow. Crass casualty obstructs the sun and rain, and dicing time for gladness casts a moan. Okay, so dicing time. So again, time is personified. Okay, so time as in just not just the passage of time. Okay, but almost like a deity. Okay, like this personification of time. But it dices, dicing time. What does he mean by that? Dicing is a curious adjective. It can mean one of two things, or possibly both. Dicing, on the one hand, dice we have when we play what are called games of chance, like which is illegal here, of course. But you have two dice, maybe one dice. You roll the dice, right, and you see what numbers you get. That's what we call these games of chance, by the way, because when you roll the dice, it's just chance, right? Okay. So on the one hand, so time could be dicing. Time sort of plays a part in chance. Or it could mean dicing, as in this. When I first read this, I thought dicing as almost like dicing vegetables, right? Like cutting. Okay, so time does what? So time cuts our lives short, or it dices our lives into different parts. Okay, we have adulthood and childhood and so on. Dices time into minutes and hours. Okay, or it is rolling the dice, okay, or it somehow has something to do with dice anyway. It is complicit with casualty. So you have chance and time, capital C, capital T. They're in cahoots. They're working together against me, but by extension against all of us. Okay, so time for gladness casts a moan. Cast is again a word like usually you cast a shadow. So time for its own happiness sort of casts a moan. Okay. These purblind doomsters had as readily strown blisses about my pilgrimage as pain. Okay. So these so this in this final two lines, the we have casualty and time are referred to as purblind doomsters. Now, what does purblind mean? Purblind, it's an archaic word. In the Middle Ages, it meant completely blind, but in Hardy's day, I think it meant partially blind. And if you look it up, that's what it'll tell you. Something that doesn't see well. So whether it's blind or completely blind, something that doesn't see well is purblind. These purblind doomsters. Doomster that's a funny word. Doom actually means not what you think it means. When we think of doom, we think, oh, this will be your doom. It's like the end of your life or something like that. The word doom comes from Old English and it actually just means judgment. Okay, so doomsday, we say in English, something that the Islamic faith also has, right? The day of judgment, the final day is the day of judgment. And in Old English, they call that doomsday, which just means the day of judgment, which also happens to be the final day, right, of your existence. Okay, but the word doom actually just means judgment. So these purblind doomsters, these blind or partially blind, judgers, okay, but they're judgers who affect my fate, okay, had as readily strewn blisses about my pilgrimage as pain. Okay, so yes, they happen to have thrown me some blisses in the pilgrimage of my life. Okay, there's another metaphor. Okay, but just as readily strewn blisses about my pilgrimage as pain. So what is even though we have two personifications here, casualty and time, this stuff just happens by chance. Okay, so these blind, so even though these two personifications have affected my life and control my fate, they do so blindly and randomly. And we go back to the top, the title, I should say, hap. Okay, so this is all chance. This is all luck. Okay, so so if we go back to the beginning, if but some vengeful god did this and that. So in other words, what is the poem trying to say to us? And I get the sense that this is Hardy also speaking to us as well. Is that there's really no good explanation for um, what the bad things that happen to us. Okay, so it just happens. But it would be in some ways we would prefer it if there was a reason for it, right? I mean, if there was this vengeful God who was making our life more difficult for no reason. This is something, by the way, to people still in all parts of the world still do. I mean, you probably have friends who say things like everything happens for a reason, right? Even your suffering happens for a reason. My sister-in-law says this a lot, and it drives me crazy, right? But it's very, very common. And to go back to the um, novel that we're all familiar with, The Bamboo Stalk, Josephine, Issa's mother, she says it a lot too. Everything happens for a reason, right? The good things and the bad things, right? So this is Hardy's kind of response, or the poet's, the speaker's response, I should say. That's his way of saying, you know what? I wish that were the case, and even if there was this vengeful God, then I could at least explain it, right? And say, okay, this is why my life sucks because there's this deity who, for some reason, has it in for me, and that's why my life sucks. But at least there's an explanation, okay? In this case, no, it's just chance. You just have bad luck. So the sense is that of course this is worse. We all want to be able to explain the bad stuff that happens to us. This was the poet's attempt, and his way of saying, "I wish it were like this, but really it's not." So again, I think this poem it still works on many levels, even though it's about 120, 130 years old, something like that. I think it still works. It is one of my favorite poems. Hardy's not very famous as a poet these days. He's more well known as a novelist, but I still like the poem. So those are two more sonnets, both with a Petrarchan structure. They both have an octave and a sestet. They both also have the volta. They both have the turn. One of the reasons I wanted to talk about these two poems was because we looked at two sonnets yesterday, both from the 16th, 17th centuries, the age of Shakespeare, by Constable and Shakespeare. And they were both love poems. In some ways, Shakespeare's is almost an anti-love poem, but they're both love poems. And that's how the sonnet started. Petrarch, who invented the sonnet, we still refer to Petrarchan sonnets, even in English. His sonnets were all written for his love, Laura, or Laura in Italian. So it began its life as love poems. That's how they came into English in the 16th century. But the sonnet is still used today, by the way. There are some contemporary examples. There's one we didn't get a chance to read. I may post for you called The Facebook Sonnet by Sherman Alexie. That was written in 2011. I don't think it's a great poem, but it is a sonnet. It's kind of clever. So it is a tough form, but one of the reasons I want to show these to you is that these were both written about 300, no, 200, 250 years after Shakespeare. So it's a form that, despite its difficulty, was still used and is still used today to a lesser extent. But primarily, I want to show you these two poems, which I do like personally. Want to show them to you to show that. The sonnet can be written on any number of subjects. They don't all have to be love poems. Okay, it'd be pretty boring if that's all sonnets talked about, and that's what a lot of them did talk about. But as early as the 19th, actually as early as the 17th century, even, John Milton was writing sonnets on different subjects about, religion or God. And in the 19th century, we have sonnets written about um, really chance, life, our existence, much more philosophical matters. So that's the primary reason I want to show these to you, is to show that despite the form not changing, you can write a sonnet on really any subject. And I think the further you stray from the original subject of a sonnet, the more interesting it gets. So there are contemporary sonnets even. Uh, I'll talk about this next class, but one your next project will be you guys telling us about a poem that you liked and sort of teaching it to us in 5 minutes. So you might consider looking for a sonnet that was written at some point in the last, say, 30, 40, 50 years. As I mentioned before, there is a poem called The Facebook Sonnet by Sherman Alexie. It's about 7 years old. I feel it's already a bit dated since Facebook is so 2010, but I think it still kind of works. So that's something you might want to take a look at. I'll post the link down below or on Moodle, and there are some other ones as well. There's one I read yesterday called Ever. Okay, if you just type in Google sonnet and then Ever, Ever. There's one from 2015, I believe it was. So the sonnet continues to be written. There's also something I vaguely remember called Trump sonnets. I haven't read any, but I know there's something out there. I think there's some or poet out there who has written something called Trump sonnets. I'm not sure if they're serious, but even if they're not, poetry works as poetry. All right, so that's it for our unit on the sonnet. I hope you guys enjoyed that. And like I said, the sonnet can be written on any subject. The sky's the limit as far as the subject matter goes. It's okay. Yeah. All right. So it's the security guard coming and wondering what all the noise was from in here. So I guess I'll use that as my cue to conclude this. I've hit 47 minutes on the nose, which I think is enough for one lesson. I think that's pretty good considering there was nobody here and I was talking to myself. But you can watch this anytime you like. But as I said before, I will ask you to be responsible for today's content, including any of the terms that I discussed. But more importantly than that, I hope you got a kick out of that and got a kick out of reading some sonnets that are written on less traditional subject matter.